Christian parenting. I'm Julie Lyles-Carr. You're listening to the All Mom Does podcast, part of the Christian Parenting Podcast Network. Today on the All Mom Does podcast, I'm your host, Julie Lyles-Carr, and I have Tracie Miles with me today from the great state of North Carolina. Tracie, thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you for having me.
Tell my listeners who you are. I've already told them that you're living in North Carolina, the kids, all the things.
Right. Well, I do live in North Carolina. I live in Charlotte, where I've lived for over 30 years. And I have 3 children. They're all grown. I have 2 that live here in Charlotte, not too far from me, and 1 that lives in Baltimore, Maryland right now. And I've been working with Proverbs 31 Ministries for about 15 years. I've been on staff full time as the director of Compel Training for the last 4 years. Between that and the book writing and everything else and family, I'm stay pretty busy.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And we love Proverbs 31 Ministries over here at the All Mom Does podcast. We've had some of your coworkers on, Karen Eamon and some others who are just amazing. And I know that we have a lot of moms who are part of that Compel program. So that is just fantastic for them to get to hear you and hear from your voice.
Yeah.
So Tracie, a few years ago, you went through an event that you had not seen coming. What was that about?
Well, that was definitely not seen coming, not anything that I ever wanted. I did go through a very abrupt separation. I had been married for 25 years. We had just celebrated our 25th anniversary and had actually gone on an anniversary trip. But just a few months after that, some things came to light that were not good, some infidelity and a lot of other situations. And so we just abruptly separated. And I never wanted divorce to be my reality, but just circumstances beyond my control, that's where I found myself. And I was kind of thrust overnight into this pit of devastating heartbreak and fear and just excessive financial challenges, and really just left in this wake of destruction and feeling like I would never be okay and wondering if I could even survive, not only just financially, but, mentally and emotionally, and if I would ever feel happy again, just wondering, how am I going to get through this? And just really, really concerned about my children and my family and just life in general.
Right. Tracie, I think when we encounter someone in a community of faith, or when we're the someone in a community of faith where it does seem to come out of the blue and things just blow up and secrets are brought to light, it can feel like, I'm guessing that, hey, I try to do everything right. We took the kids to church all the time, and I'm working in this ministry, and we were the couple that people looked up to, and now it's all gone sideways. Did you feel a sense of that? Like, how can this go so wrong when we've been trying to do things so right?
Oh, absolutely. I had been working in ministry for many, many years. And so, that brought on a lot of shame, which is a whole nother topic. But we did go to church. We were in church every time the doors opened. We wanted to be good Christian parents. Not that we were perfect by any means, but we did, try to raise the kids in church and do the things that we, wanted to walk with God and raise our family that way. So it was really difficult. And you wonder, like, why did God let this happen to us? Because I'd been praying for my marriage. We'd had difficulties, just like every marriage has. But this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And it's very devastating when it does happen.
I feel like, Tracie, and correct me if I'm wrong, if maybe you've had a different experience, but I've been in ministry a long time too. And divorce does not seem to be one of those preemptive topics that we discuss. We can put a lot of time into talking to people about how to raise their kids well and how to nurture their marriages and things like that. But it doesn't feel like we prepare people for if divorce is the outcome. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's always seemed to be a little bit of a taboo subject because, the Bible says that God hates divorce, and that is what Scripture says. But God does not hate the people who get divorced. And that's where I think some of the misconceptions come in. He loves his children and he loves everyone regardless of what their marital status is. So I think a lot of times the churches tiptoe around that situation. And I know in my own experience, I went to the same church for 20 years. So that was another really difficult thing when I did get separated and then eventually divorced, is I felt kind of displaced from my church because I didn't want to go back and sit in the same pew where I had been sitting, for 20 years with my husband and my children, because it just felt awkward and uncomfortable, and I didn't feel like I belonged there. And there was also no place for me there as a single woman, especially not as a divorced woman. There were no groups or anything like that. So I think it's a place in the church and in the ministry realm that has not been given the amount of attention that it needs, because there are so many Christians, good Christian women and men, that are suffering through these types of situations that really need that kind of hope and encouragement, and to be fueled in their faith and, ministered to, even though they have this situation. So I don't know exactly the whole history of why it's avoided, but I think part of it is it's because it's seen as something it's not God's will. We've made a covenant before God to be married, and that's how, we want it to stay. And of course, that's how no one gets married with the intent of getting divorced. We all want to stay married, but sometimes things happen.
Right. I think when we talk about ministry to women, and obviously not just exclusively to women, because men also are going through divorces themselves when they're on the other side. But I tend to find that a lot of women find themselves unprepared, even if they have had a career, even if they have been working outside the home, or they're the one who's been running the bills on a day-to-day basis, that sometimes women find themselves with a whole gap that opens of things that they didn't know about. So how can women, in a way that is still supportive of their marriage and loving of their marriage, but through what you experienced, what are some things that women can think about, again, not under the idea of, I might want to one day end my marriage, but just things that are basic that we might want to keep an eye on just because it's just being wise? Right.
Well, one thing that I learned the hard way is, although we do want to be, submissive to our husbands and in a way that is honoring to both parties, we also don't want to live in the dark. And that is something that I did for a long time. And I will confess to doing that, because I let my husband, he took care of the money. He had paid all the bills. And so when we did separate, I was left to completely dig myself out of a hole and figure out how to do everything on my own. What are all the passwords to all the online accounts? What's due? And that sounds kind of bad on myself, but you just fall into this routine of, you're taking care of the kids, you're doing your thing, and your husband's working and he's doing his thing. And I did have some employment, and I, was working in ministry and doing some freelance corporate work, but he was primarily responsible for the finances. So my biggest piece of advice would be, regardless of whether you're getting married next week or whether you've been married 10 years, is to partner with your husband in your finances and know everything that you need to know. Because whether you're getting divorced or whether something tragic happens to your spouse, you don't want to be in a position to where you're left just really confused and in the dark and afraid about how to move forward, and what are all the things that you need to take care of to support you and your family.
Right, right. Once the divorce happened, once that decision was made and you followed through and ended the marriage, what was the thing that surprised you the most on the other side of that? I mean, of course, there was the surprise and shock of when the marriage started coming apart and you began discovering things. But once you kind of got through that shock, what was the thing that surprised you once things were finalized?
Well, I guess that could be a twofold answer. In the beginning, there was, there's so many stages of grief that you go through. And that's one thing that I've done a lot of research on, and I included a lot of that information in the book, because what I didn't realize is that losing someone through divorce is just like losing someone through a death. It's just the death of someone that's still living. So you're basically mourning the death of many things: the death of the life you once knew, the death of a relationship that you had, the death of your intact family, the death of your financial stability. But, you're mourning the death of someone that is still here. They're just not with you. And the death of all these things that I just mentioned. So there's just so much grief that happens. And then there's so many overwhelming fears that come about. But then coupled with that, in my situation, there was also some sense of relief almost and freedom, because you're out from under some toxicity that had been going on for quite some time. And then after a while, you enter that stage of, okay, now I'm lonely, and maybe I want to go back to those things. And you start wondering, well, did I make the right decision? And then you're in denial, and you're bargaining with God. Like, well, what if I did this? And what if I did that? Then you start doubting yourself. And so I think one of the things that was really surprising to me is just the constant ongoing merry-go-round of emotions and thoughts that we struggle with. And it just really takes a lot of faith and a lot of being grounded in knowing who you are and having self-confidence and being sure of, who God is and that he's never going to leave you, to really just walk through those stages and get through everything.
Right, right. Those stages I think are so important to note, because a lot of times in my world and the friends that I've had who've been through this experience, I don't know that they would have identified it as grief. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in understanding that that's what it is. And there are stages we know that people need to walk through. The book that you're referring to that you have this information in is called Living Unbroken, Reclaiming Your Life and Your Heart After Divorce. But you were actually in the process of writing a different book that came out of a little while ago when all of this went down. And the title of that book, which is really interesting, is Unsinkable Faith. Mm-hmm. How did you manage? Because I would feel like that would almost feel like an ironic kick in the shins, honestly, Tracie, to be writing a book on that kind of topic and to be walking through this kind of cataclysmic experience. How did you navigate a sense, perhaps, were you angry with God? Were you frustrated? Did it almost seem like the things that you were writing about, you were just having to do from a very different place than necessarily really feeling it in your gut at the time? What was that like?
It was a very, very unique experience. And I wrote actually 3 books since that has happened. And so Living Unbroken is the 3rd one since I've been separated and divorced. But it truly has been a God-given divine miracle that I had these books to write, even though it's been so difficult, because it was just a few months prior to my husband leaving that I had gotten these book contracts. And so regardless of what was going on in my personal life, I had signed these contracts. And so I had these deadlines to write.
To get it done. Yeah.
Yeah, I had to get it done. So at first I was like, okay, I told my publisher, this has happened to me. No book is going to get written. No words are going to come. Nothing is going to happen. But all I could do at that time was pour myself into my faith. I mean, that's all I had left. I had to be strong for my kids. I had to keep taking one step at a time, one day at a time. And so writing the words that I felt almost kind of a little annoyed that I had to keep writing, like I have to do this job and my heart's not in it and I don't know what I'm going to write. But it was the writing of that book that really helped me in the process of my healing, because that book, Unsinkable Faith, the subtitle is God-Filled Strategies for Transforming the Way You Think, Feel, and Live. So the whole entire book is focused on transforming your thoughts from negative to positive. So had I not been writing that book, I probably would have stayed stuck in that pit of negative thinking. But I was reading books on transforming your mind and all these really interesting books about brains and how they operate and how, MRIs change when you change the way that you think. And it was really just amazing. And then the book after that was Love Life Again and just learning how to find joy. So I can just see God's hand in all 3 of these books that has just been a huge tool for me and his way of really helping me recover and heal and move forward in a way that I would have never been able to do otherwise.
Right. And having to walk it out as you're writing it. I think that's really, really profound. Yes. Tracie, it's interesting that you mentioned that this book that you've now written specifically on life after divorce didn't come until 4 books in, right? After you had this experience. At what point do you think in someone's healing process, they're ready to be able to share in this kind of format? Because one thing that I feel that we sometimes do is somebody walks through something and 6 months later, we're like, what have you learned? What's happened? And all of a sudden we put them in this position of needing to be the authority. But healing doesn't always, getting a little bit better step by step doesn't mean that you're necessarily ready at that point to be the mentor and the leader to say, here's how to do it. Here's how to survive it. For you, when did that place come where you felt like, okay, I'm healed up enough that now I feel like I can go back into this without it being something that I'm weirdly jumping back into again and getting down again and getting depressed again, or, whatever the emotion was. What are those markers for knowing we're healed to a place that maybe we are ready to experience and navigate what you've done in the writing of this book?
Well, I think those markers are different for everyone. And it's just a personal journey of healing. And I don't think anybody is ever going to be like, I will never say that I am on the other side and I am victorious and I'm just in this amazing place and, I'm just ready to take on the world. I'm over it and I'm never going to think about it again. We're never going to get to a place to where we've completely healed every single wound that's ever happened to us. But we can get to a place to where when we can talk about it, I think, without completely breaking down in tears, and when we have a calling to really minister to someone else because God has said, okay, I brought you through this. And now this person is here and they need to know that they're going to get through this too. And when you feel called to help that person and you're able to do that without it hindering you, I think that's kind of a marker that you're ready to take a step forward. But we do need to be careful that we don't take that step too quickly, because we need to let God work on our hearts first before we can really start pouring into other people.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of us need to be doing that self-inventory in whatever we've experienced to make sure that when we get ready to pay it forward to try to help someone else, to take a really good look at what it's doing to us internally. Of course, it's going to stir up things. Of course, there's going to be emotion that comes with it. But it feels like to me, if we begin to find that we're ruminating on it, that we are continuing to loop back to it, that might be a strong indicator that maybe this isn't exactly the time or the situation we need to be going in full on like we are at this point. What did you do with your kids when all of this happened that you felt like was really great? And is there something you wish you had done a little bit differently when it came to walking your kids through this experience?
Mm-hmm. Well, my children were older, so I had one still in high school. I think he was a junior, and the other two were in college. So they weren't little children that I could just say, mommy and daddy decided to separate or whatever. And they had been around and they had seen things. So I did tell them all the situations that had happened and was very open with them. We'd always had a very close relationship. And so I did talk to them a great deal and kept them in the loop. And so I think that drew us all very close together and helped us all walk through. They felt very open in sharing their feelings, their anger, their emotions. On the flip side of that, there probably are times that I shared a little too much. So in hindsight, they were kind of my best friends, and I didn't have a lot of people to talk to because you don't want everybody to know your business. So that was kind of like a double-edged sword. So if I were cautioning someone about that, especially if you have older children or younger children, I guess, but younger children, you kind of know there's a little bit more boundaries there. Just to always be cautious about what you do share despite how old they are.
Right, right. You've been really vulnerable and transparent about the emotional toll of all of this and the places that it sidelined your sense of self-confidence, those feelings of shame. What do you think are some of the more common emotions that someone typically might experience as they're walking through a divorce experience that they should be on alert for? And what do you do to combat some of those feelings that you're already down, you're already in a grief process? But when someone, say, passes away, it's not necessarily going to also usher in a sense of, maligning your sense of self-confidence. It's not going to usher in a sense of shame in a way that a divorce process might. So how do you pay attention to those emotions that are coming up, and what do you do about it?
Well, there's just so many. I'm not even sure how to pinpoint something to answer that question, but I would say the first few months I literally walked around in a blur. Like I don't even remember. I remember driving down the road one day, and I've written about this before, and I think I went 30 minutes past my exit on the interstate because I just lived in this fog. I couldn't even keep my thoughts straight, and I couldn't go through a single day without crying, and I could spend hours and hours in the bed, and I had never really understood depression until that period. You can't understand something until you're really in it and you've walked those shoes. So there's just so many emotions that you go through, and then you start thinking, well, gosh, am I just crazy? Like, why can't I pull myself out of this? What's wrong with me? And then I recall another day going to a doctor's appointment, and I talk about this in Living Unbroken also. And I just had to fill out some doctor's forms. It was a regular checkup, and it's asking, address and phone number and blah, blah, blah. And then it says marital status. And divorced or separated was not one of the boxes. And so I couldn't check any of the boxes. And so I was like, well, who am I? Where do I fit in? I'm not a wife. I'm not a widow. I'm not this. And so I just had this full-blown identity crisis. And I think that's something that women deal with so much, especially if your children have also left. So I was going through this separation and divorce also as I was entering this empty nest syndrome.
At the same time. Wow. Yeah.
So I was having all of these things going on at the same time, and it was just so difficult. And there's just so many things to try to juggle that you really have to just remember who you are in Christ and really lean on your friends and lean on your Christian sisters and brothers in Christ, and, just remember who you are.
Right. How do you do the self-check of what to share? Because here you've written a book on your experience and to encourage other women, and what needs to stay quiet. Because I do think we have an issue, right? That we don't talk about divorce enough. We don't really discuss it as much as we probably should in our circles of faith. We don't really know what to do to help people through the process. So there's that side where it's not being talked about enough. But then the flip side is the challenge of knowing exactly what to say. I had Barb Roos on episode 145, and we can link that in the show notes, where she talked a little bit about her process in continuing to write and speak and acknowledge that this divorce happened, but having to navigate these strange waters of exactly what is too much to say and what needs to be said. How are you navigating that in terms of being transparent and sharing your heart, but also maybe not overdoing it?
Right. Well, that's something that I have had a lot of training on over the years, not only in writing, but also, I've been working with Lisa Turkhurst for so long, and I train a lot of writers on that specifically, because most writers start with their story. They have a story to tell. Whether you want to write a book or a devotion or you have a blog, you want to tell your story. That's usually where your words are going to be birthed out of. So it's a struggle that a lot of people have, because you want to share your story, but other people are involved. And there are things that you probably don't need to share because you have to protect the other people. So it is a fine line, but I think the focus just needs to be on you and your experience. So that's what I usually try to remember when I'm writing, is I want to share, here's what I felt, here's what I went through, here's what God did in my life, in my heart. You have to share the experiences, but you don't want to share every single detail. You don't want to share things that are going to be scandalous about someone else. You don't want to necessarily criticize the other people, or, because God has to deal with those people, and that may be their story to tell.
Right.
So what we usually try to focus on as writers when we're asked this question is to keep the focus on, what is it that I'm going through? What is it that God is teaching me? What emotions am I having that other people might have? What needs do I have that other people might be struggling with as well? And really try to hone in on those.
Tracie, we're all hearing stories today of couples who've been through a divorce and yet end up somehow with this really deep friendship. Or then we hear about a couple that they are mortal enemies forever. What should be the goal? I'm not saying there's a one size fits all. I'm not saying there's a standard goal, but what do you think we should head toward if we find ourselves in this situation that is maybe the best of what can be offered when it comes to relationship with that former spouse?
Well, obviously the best situation would be to have an amicable relationship. So especially if you have children, but unfortunately that's just not always the case, depending on the personalities or any kind of addictions or disorders or anything of the other person. So the goal would always be to have a good relationship. But if that's not the case, then it really takes a lot of work and a lot of heart and a lot of prayer to figure out how to navigate life when that's not possible.
Right, right. And it does seem to me that it's very case by case. But at the end of the day, I'm guessing that you feel probably compelled by God to bring in a level of forgiveness. What does the forgiveness journey look like for you?
Well, it's not easy.
Right. Yeah.
And there's always triggers that pull you back into that anger. In fact, even this week, I'm dealing with a financial issue that's still just a repercussion of something that was done many years ago that I wasn't aware of, but it's still kind of falling on my head, and I can't, it's out of my control. And so that will pull me right back into being angry and unforgiving. But unforgiveness is not going to help me continue to have joy in my life. And so that's something that I have to keep reminding myself is, from the worldly perspective, I have every right to be angry. I have every right to be unforgiving. And most people that get divorced, there are reasons why they do have a right to be unforgiving and to be angry. But from a godly perspective, all that does is hold us hostage to unhappiness. So the longer we feel justified in holding on to that anger, the stronger the foothold the devil can have in our heart, and the tighter, that anger can become. So the sooner that we can just breathe and just ask God to help us forgive when everything in us doesn't want to, and especially if the other person doesn't ask for it and we feel that they don't deserve it, then the better off that we're going to be.
Absolutely. You have a couple of tools that you have developed for women to think through. You call them happiness prompters and healing steps. Tell me what those are and how they can help in this journey.
Yeah. Well, these are things that I have at the end of each chapter of Living Unbroken. And it's just so easy to get stuck in unhappiness and buried in all the problems and the worries when you're going through separation and divorce that we forget to take care of ourselves. And we can also start counting our burdens every day. All you can see is the problems instead of your blessings. And all we think about is, what are the things that I'm going to have to deal with today? It's a drudgery to get out of bed because I've been there and I did it for many, many months.
Right.
So I just wanted to provide some opportunities for people to wake up and read these prompters and think, okay, I can do this. Even if it's just look out the window and look for something amazing, or while you're walking down the street, find someone that you can smile at or give a compliment to, or do something to treat yourself today. Just little prompters that will bring a little bit of happiness to yourself. And over time, it's like putting a little pebble on a stack on the ground. Over time, the more pebbles you add, the bigger the pile is going to grow. So the more things that you do to fuel that happiness, the happier and the more joyful that you're going to feel. And so the healing steps are actual action steps to help people move towards healings. And it's to process their thoughts and emotions. It's kind of like self-therapy, but just to really help people unearth those things they may not even realize are standing in their way of healing. So I just hope that these are things that will really help women move forward rather than staying just stuck in the muck of the situation that they're in.
Right. Tracie, I've had friends who have said at the end of their marriages, I never, ever, ever want to have a romantic relationship again. And I have other friends that within a matter of months have been running into the next romantic relationship. What do you think is wisdom when it comes to that? Because we know women who really struggle with the sense of feeling like they don't have identity if they're not in a romantic relationship. And we have other women who maybe are going to slam the door on something that maybe God has for them down the line. How should that be walked through?
Well, I will confess from firsthand experience that after my husband had left, and it had been on, like I mentioned, a kind of a rocky road for a while, I just really longed for someone to love me. I wanted to find someone that would love me. And so I can understand the women that they're just so longing for that outlet, and they immediately want to start dating, or they immediately fall into the first relationship that seems like it will be a good thing. But I've also learned that that's probably not the best thing, because you need time to process. You need time to rediscover yourself, figure out who you are, who you want to be, who you want to be with. You need time to learn to be alone and to be just yourself. And I've got several stories in the book that women so vulnerably shared with me about mistakes. I share a lot of my own mistakes that I made, but just kind of the pros and cons of doing that type of thing regarding that subject. So again, it's all on a personal basis, but I would encourage women just to give it some time and give themselves time to heal and think and figure out what they really want for the future before they run into something too quickly.
Great, great wisdom. You have a statement, the end of your marriage is not the end of you, which I think is fantastic. Unpack that for listeners, what you mean by that.
Well, that really came about. It was a huge God whisper that I experienced one day. And it was really after driving home from that doctor's appointment that I just mentioned, after having that identity crisis sitting in the doctor's office lobby. And I was driving home and I was just in tears and trying to figure out, I don't even know who I am anymore. And God just whispered to my heart, the end of your marriage is not the end of you. And so it kind of opened my eyes to the point that I am still me. I am still here. I still have a lot of life to live. I have an amazing family, beautiful children. I have health. I have a great life. I'm alive. I get to wake up every day. I mean, there's so many beautiful things that we forget because we've tied ourselves and our entire life to this one person or to this marriage or to being a wife. But we are individuals. We are valuable individuals. We are women that God created. And just because our marital status changed does not mean that our life has ended, even though it feels that way. I know it feels that way. But it was just a divine moment with God when he reminded me that you're going to be okay. And you're going to get through this. And I'm not going to leave your side. Your marriage may be over, but you've got a lot of life left to live, and it's going to be good. And that is really what kind of started fueling this, allowing him to use my pain for the purpose of helping other women realize that what God told me is also the same for them.
Great, great advice. So much wisdom there. The book is Living Unbroken, Reclaiming Your Life and Your Heart After Divorce. Tracie, thanks so much for being with us today. I know that your experience is going to just be gold and so helpful to so many. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You'll find more from this episode on the show notes. Be sure and check them out at allmomdoes.com. And wanted to ask you a big favor. Be sure and go to wherever you are listening to this podcast and give us a 5-star rating and review. It really helps us get the word out about the podcast. Can't wait to see you next time on the All Mom Does podcast.